So welcome to the second half of our evening and the continuation of the exploration of the threefold way of ethics, meditation and wisdom. So following on from the last 3 weeks, during which we've explored the importance of Buddhist meditation, tonight begins the first of 4 weeks looking into some of the classic wisdom teachings of Buddhism. So over the coming weeks, we'll be looking at karma and rebirth, the 3 marks of conditioned existence, and the Buddha's 4 noble truths. However, tonight we'll be starting with arguably one of the most important teachings of the Buddha, and that is conditionality. But before I introduce the subject, I wanted to say something about Buddhist wisdom from a general perspective. So in a way, this echoes what I said last week when we looked at higher levels of consciousness or super conscious states and their importance in truly starting to develop wisdom from a Buddhist perspective. And one formulation of the development of wisdom in Buddhism is that there are 3 progressive stages to developing wisdom. So I'm just going to talk through these. So the first one is wisdom, which comes from hearing and learning. So we need to hear and learn the basic teachings. So if we're practicing Buddhists, we need to know the basic formulations off by heart, the precepts, the hindrances, levels of going for refuge, and so on. And when we know these things off by heart, they become a part of our thinking. So if we're in the class at the center now, I would be looking for someone and waiting for you to name the 5 hindrances or the 5 precepts, but I'm not going to be doing that this evening. But it's good to start trying to learn some of these simple formulations, many of which come in lists, which may make them easier to understand, easier to remember. But of course, some of you may be like me and didn't have a great experience at school. So traditional education may be a bit daunting, but over the years, I've learned various ways to help things sink in, at least at this fundamental level. So I like to take notes when I'm listening to a talk. And in fact, the best way for me to cement things on this level is to actually transcribe a talk, which I use quite often as a very useful practice. So the second stage is wisdom, which comes from thinking and reflecting. So this includes reflecting on the Dharma on our own, but as well, it includes discussing Buddhist ideas with other Buddhists. So again, I've learned that not being afraid to vocalize my initial thoughts with others that I feel safe with is a good way to help develop and shape my own ideas. And it's also good to do this with people from different backgrounds, different temperaments, different life experiences, different imaginations, and it helps us to see things from different angles. It's what I hope you experience in the discussion groups after these talks, if you're part of the Zoom class, or if you're in study groups, which we also facilitate here at the Colchester Buddhist Centre. So it's actually the opposite of the social media bubbles that we can join. So often in these, everyone has the very same, very narrow view, and it becomes a bit of an echo chamber where we start to believe that we must be right about some cause or political view because everybody agrees with us, and because everyone's coming from that same starting point. To an extent, it shuts off us from a wider perspective. So finally, the third step, and I should say that these are progressive steps in developing wisdom, is wisdom that comes from meditative development. So usually we need the clarity and focus of meditation to develop this level of wisdom in its fullness. But when this does come about, it's usually as the result of a deep experience of the previous level. So we know the Dharma at an intellectual level, we've reflected on it deeply, it's become part of our thinking, it's kind of seeped into our bones. So then when we meditate on it, it can really transform us. And we don't need to devote a whole meditation session to this. Sometimes we can bring certain Buddhist concepts to mind. This is something I like to do just briefly during that quiet period after a particularly still and calm meditation. We can also do this in our ordinary life when we realize we've slipped into that slightly higher level of consciousness. So maybe when we're out in nature, or maybe when we're listening to music. So we can just bring in some of these Buddhist concepts and just allow them to permeate within us. So this evening, I'm going to give you one of those short, on the surface, very simple teachings of the Buddha that you can apply these principles of developing wisdom to. And tonight I'm going to be talking about something that we sometimes call conditionality. So this is a central concept that the Buddha used to try to communicate his insight into the way things are. So it's sometimes translated as conditioned co-production or dependent co-arising, dependent origination. And these are all translations of the Sanskrit term praticca samutpada. And praticca samutpada could be translated as meaning something like existing on account of arising together. But I really like this more poetic description, which I think sums it up really well. This being, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become. From the ceasing of this, that ceases. So here is a short and neat verse that you can learn and memorize as part of your journey into Buddhist wisdom. And what this means is that everything that occurs is contingent, is dependent upon a number of other events occurring. Things don't happen randomly or by chance. So from a Buddhist perspective, there's really no such thing as luck. So this teaching says that all occurrences and events come about because of conditions and exist only as long as the conditions that keep them in being exist. So all phenomena constantly condition and interact with a host of other phenomena. So nothing exists independently as a thing in itself, separate from everything else. And that includes ourselves. So for example, you joining this class on Zoom this evening, or if you're watching this talk on YouTube, that was dependent on a whole lot of other conditions. So you might think you're watching this for one single reason. Maybe you decided to. And of course, that is one of the conditions. You chose to do this rather than go for a walk, read a book, do some housework, or watch something else entirely. But actually, that's not just it. In fact, a lot of things needed to be in place to enable you to be hearing these words. Not least, of course, is the technology required to allow you to do this. And actually, there's something quite profound and quite beautiful about this whole idea that everything arises and passes away. And when we start to apply those three levels of wisdom, something almost magical can start to open up. We can begin to become less concerned with the trivia of life. Certain things we've been attached to just pass away. Our hard grip on things, on wanting our own way, on keeping hold of things just begins to loosen. Those things don't seem to matter so much anymore because we know that everything arises and passes away. And it helps to point to the impermanence of everything, something that I believe Niyamas will be helping us to explore more deeply in a few weeks. So from a simple perspective, you can just stay with this formulation and follow those three steps to wisdom I described earlier. However, if you feel that intellectually you'd like a little bit more, then I'm going to expand on this articulation of conditionality by describing another model, which is known as the 5 levels of conditionality, or the 5 Niyamas. And the word Niyama translates as a natural law or cosmic order. So we're going to look at these one at a time. The first 3 we could equate with modern science and what our teacher Sangharakshita described once as the lower evolution. So let's start with the first, which is called Uta Niyama, which contains inorganic physical processes. So here we have the natural laws that orders the change of seasons and phenomena related to climate and the weather. We have those natural laws we learnt about in science at school, and I've probably forgotten most of them, like gravity, motion, magnetism, etc. Now, we don't have to know how these operate. In fact, we don't actually have to believe in them. We could refuse to accept that gravity is a natural law, but that probably wouldn't stop us falling flat on our face if we stood up and simply leaned forward. So secondly is the natural law of living matter, what we would think of as biology in the main. So this includes things like photosynthesis and genetics, as well as the arising and spread of a virus like COVID-19, which is obviously now spread throughout the world. Next is Manoniyama, which corresponds to our cognitive, perceptual, instinctual, psychological processes. So this covers what I would call mental operations. So for example, when we open our eyes and simply see something, that's a mental operation. And it also covers the process of perception, so the recognition of what our eyes are seeing. There's also automatic reactions. For example, if someone pokes something in your eye, there will be an automatic response to blink. So another example here might be the fight or flight response, or our instinctual need to seek food, shelter, and to reproduce. These can all be considered as belonging to the Manoniyama, but we need to be careful not to try and label things as belonging to this level or that level. So remember the principle that everything arises in dependence on conditions, plural. So these levels of conditionality can all be operating simultaneously. So for example, we know that COVID-19 can be caught by being in close proximity of someone and breathing in expelled droplets of air containing the virus, which we could say is the previous niyama, the biological niyama at work. And then our instinct to follow the social distancing rules could be said to be influenced by the manoniyama, our instinct to protect ourselves. So they're the first 3. Now we come on to the last 2, and probably the more interesting of these levels of conditionality. So up until now, you may have been able to see the logic, the intellectual sense, educational influence coming in those last 3. But the last 2, the final 2, are where Buddhist views really come into play. So the final 2 form part what our teacher Sangharakshita referred to as the higher evolution. So the first of these is the karma niyama. So you may be a bit disappointed that this evening I'm not going to say much about karma niyama, as my talk next week is solely going to be about karma and also rebirth. But briefly, karma niyama is the law of ethics or moral causation. So all of our volitional, our intentional thoughts, words and deeds, our actions, bring about effects, and that process is often simply called karma. But there is a lot more to it than that, and karma is often misunderstood, but I'll be hoping to shine more of a light on that next week. So for this evening, it may be enough to say that the karma niyama specifically refers to the effects of ethical and unethical actions that we have some choice about. So these are intentional actions, whether they are of our body, speech or mind. And we can notice that skillful actions have skillful consequences. Unskillful actions can have painful results. So during the lockdown that we've been experiencing, we've had a choice about our response to that situation. So at times we may have resisted the restrictions we've had to follow. We may have felt irritation, frustration, and even anger at the action of others, but how we respond to what we experience is our choice. And you may have noticed the effect of your choices on your own mental state as well as on the mental state of others. And this begins to highlight the importance of the karma niyama as the initial stage of this higher evolution that ultimately leads to liberation from suffering. So now finally we have the Dharma niyama. This is the most mysterious and most difficult to describe of the levels of conditionality. And one way of looking at this is to see it as a natural spiritual law. It's the influence of the deep spiritual workings of the universe. So there's a spontaneous unfolding in relation to the Dharma niyama, brought about by the work we do at the level of choice, at the level of karma niyama. So finally, in summary, I wanted to make it clear that these complex processes of conditionality are at work constantly in our lives. We can't begin to try and understand them, and we certainly can't control them. However, by realizing that we have a choice in relation to our own actions, by acting skillfully in our actions of body, speech, and mind, we can begin to see how we can make progress and start moving towards alignment with the workings of the universe, awareness of a spontaneous unfolding, and the experience of deeper levels of consciousness, and ultimately the attainment of freedom. So let's just return to that very poetic encapsulation of conditionality, the one for you to learn and memorize, and apply the 3 levels of developing wisdom to. This being, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become. From the ceasing of this, that ceases. So that's all for my talk this evening. So if you have joined on YouTube, thank you very much for being with us this evening.